TRT World's defence analyst Oubai Shahbandar joins me now for more on the story. Oubai, good to see you. Let's start with this missile attack on Riyadh overnight. What exactly happened there? We know it was from Yemen. What are the expected consequences?
Well, this seems to be the greatest amount of missiles, ballistic missiles, that were fired against Saudi Arabia since the war began over 3 years ago. They were launched by the Houthi militias. They've taken claim for these attacks. Now, in previous missile strikes against Saudi Arabia from Yemen, the Saudi government has blamed Iran, specifically the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, for providing the missile components and helping the Houthi militias launch these attacks against Saudi Arabia. It's still not clear whether or not we will see any official claim from Riyadh that will hold the Iranians or the Iranian government as being behind these attacks. But, you know, it definitely seems like a significant escalation. None of these missiles hit their intended targets. We've seen some images, some reports that some of these missiles may have been intercepted by the Patriot missile batteries outside of Riyadh, although some of those missile batteries may have malfunctioned. But one thing is very clear, that after over 3 years of conflict in Yemen, there's really no end in sight to that horrible conflict. Millions are at risk of starvation. A recent UN report, in fact, has said that after nearly 3 years of conflict, Yemen as a state has officially ceased to exist. We're talking about 20 million people, most of whom are at risk of starvation or severe malnutrition. The Houthi militias are still fighting the forces on the ground that are backed by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, the Houthis have lost considerable ground, but they still control the capital, Sana'a. So we seem to be at a stalemate at a time when neither side in this conflict seem to be backing down. So certainly a significant escalation to this conflict with these missile attacks. Is Iran behind them? We will soon find out what the Saudi government reaction is going to be at a time when both international watchdogs have pinned the blame on Iran in previous instances to providing advanced missile components to the Houthi militia. So more than likely, this is just another continuation of a wider proxy war in the region between the Iranian axis on one side and Saudi Arabia and its allies.
Clearly, it's the Yemeni civilians who are the biggest losers here. But 3 years in, the war, as you say, seems to show no sign of ending. So if nobody is winning, are we saying that the two sides are equally matched? Is that the problem?
Well, you're facing an asymmetric warfare situation, and Yemen is a complex battlefield. We're even seeing some indicators of infighting between some of the Yemeni factions aligned with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So a lot of complexity here. It's not just a clear civil war, clear-cut conflict between one side and the other. There are multiple intervening players in this conflict. In fact, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is still a factor here. They still control some towns and villages in the northern and central part of Yemen. Daesh even has some elements in Yemen. So multiple players here at hand. And of course, the civilians are the ones that are bearing the brunt of this conflict. The Al Hudaydah port is still barely functional. So essentially, the Yemeni people can barely get enough food and medicines at a time when also the Saudi Arabian alliance is blaming the Houthis for using those ports to smuggle in weapons instead of allowing civilian aid to the people that desperately need it. The Houthis claim, on the other hand, that the Saudis and their allies are essentially trying to invade the country. So at the end of the day, although you have Iran fighting this conflict in an asymmetric type of warfare, it's really the civilians at the end of the day that are the ones suffering the most, as you said.
So what would it take to bring this to some sort of conclusion? If there's so many complex players within the war, is it maybe more intervention from the outside observers? What is it that is going to change the situation? Well,
the United Nations has a mechanism in place, and we're seeing that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, is going to meet with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres tomorrow at the UN headquarters. But when you have very little incentive for both warring sides to sit down and negotiate in earnest, it's very difficult to strike a peace deal. It seems that Iran is still covertly supporting its proxies, and of course Saudi Arabia and its allies are still supporting their proxies on the ground until really Riyadh and Tehran agree to end the fighting. I don't think that the Houthis and their opponents are going to sit down and negotiate anytime soon, sadly.
Oubai Shahbandar there talking through a very bleak situation in Yemen. Many thanks.